Welcome to the webinar. This is Fearless Security's Technical Security Architecture, the details part 4. There's only one part of the details left after this. Today we're going to talk about perception and behavioral protections. This is the outline for today. We're focused in on this portion of the architecture. I'm just going to take you to all.net where you can click on protection and see a similar picture. And this is a clickable diagram, so anything you click on appears down below. And then you can also access the standards of practice we're talking about over on the left-hand side. We'll get to that in a few seconds. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Well, in the area of perception, people often question the use of the soft sciences, the so-called soft sciences for security. I have a saying, the soft sciences are the hard sciences, and the hard sciences are the easy sciences. Basically, changing the way people see things is not viewed as computer security, whatever that is. And then they talk about, this stuff is too unpredictable to really use. You can't really use this perception stuff. It's not certain to work properly. In terms of behavioral controls, are we talking about electric shock here? It isn't manipulation of people something that's frowned on. Aren't you worried about liability issues? These are, just two of the many notional objections you get until you drill down into the reality. If you abandon fear and try to use reason to look at this, we believe that facts bring clarity and that ignorance is not bliss. Examples of perception and behavioral controls are things like obscurity, keeping a low profile, dealing with appearances, the use of deception, and so forth. And they've long been effective methods for protection. And while people say security through obscurity is a bad thing, in fact, there's some obscurity involved in all protection. I mean, consider that your password, you want to make it obscure so people don't easily guess it. I know that when people talk about security through obscurity, that's not what they're referring to, but when you try to pin them down, it's unclear what they're really saying. Behavioral controls, things like limiting changes, fail-safe and fault-tolerant operations, intrusion anomaly detection, clearly in the behavioral realm, response systems, and so forth. These are core elements of many protective programs. So I think the point here is that you shouldn't shun what you don't understand. You should learn about it and try to figure out where it applies and where it's reasonable to do, and then use it. Of course, at Fearless, we run a business and we use perception and behavioral controls. And here are just some examples of the things we do. We try not to become a target. We do this by not advertising what to attack. A great example is we got a server from a vendor, and when you install it, it has a web interface, and the web interface advertises, "Hey, we're secure," and gives the name of the server and the name of the organization and all this stuff right up on the front page. You don't have to log in or anything. And it sort of advertises how strong it is. From our perspective, you're just asking to be attacked. Why would you do that? We'd prefer to be obscure. We avoid things like the normal ports for high-valued services. So if we're going to run a high-valued service to a limited set of customers, or for internal use, we won't put it on the standard ports. We'll make it inobvious, where it is, why it is, and so forth. We use deception against intelligence efforts. So when people, scan our networks or try to find out about us, some of the information they get is just wrong. And we don't invite attacks by claiming perfection. We're not. We try to keep a low profile for our technology. But, we don't necessarily put all of the things that we think are important under the business's name or put it on the website. And we also try to reduce attacks by not overreacting. Sometimes people try to get you to react to what they're doing, and very often avoiding those reactions is beneficial to the defender. Behavioral protections, we use change control, and we limit the behaviors of programs. We limit authorized behaviors of users and look for deviations. Try to minimize what systems do so that they only operate for the things necessary to the extent we reasonably can. We try to work with people who have a history of good behavior. We're not likely to hire people with extensive criminal backgrounds just because it doesn't benefit us in the security business. When people have served their time, they're done, and that's fine. But depends on what you're trusting them for, just like anyone else. And we try to reduce the time and effort spent on defenses. And so we use perception and behavioral controls so that we spend less time and avoid problems rather than having to react and respond. So that's what we do, and we apply our standard of practice to do this. Our standard of practice is not a standard. It's not something you follow. It is what we consider to be a set of reasonable and prudent practices. Where reasonable and prudent sort of differentiates diligent from negligent. But these are not the only such practices. There are plenty of other practices that are reasonable and prudent. We're not saying that if you don't do these, you're no good. We're just saying if you do these things in a reasonable way, then you're being prudent. And of course, the standard of practice isn't always applicable. There's always some case that's a little bit unusual where it doesn't apply. It's all peer-reviewed. It's all openly available. You can go pick one, open the link on a new tab, go down and look at it. You can look at control architecture identity proofing. It tells you what the set of alternatives are for identity proofing. It tells you what the standard of practice indicates as a reasonable and prudent decision. It tells you the basis for that and gives you additional details. And that's available to anyone and everyone. It's peer reviewed. We welcome other people to review it. We welcome your comments. We use it internally, but we also use it to help our experts ask a reasonably comprehensive set of questions, codify responses consistently in a defined language so that we are using the same words. We use it to guide decisions, but we don't use it to make decisions. We want experts to make good decisions using this to help them. And we try to identify variances from baseline. So if we find a decision that's a good one that we don't have listed and it applies to more than one client or one situation, we try to update the standard of practice so that it's adapted to the new circumstance. And as things change over time, we try to adapt them. So let's drill down into the standard of practice relative to perception. Turns out perception is a cross-cutting issue in terms of technology. An example is access controls. Access control typically does things like preventing read-write access by subject, or which is basically users based on user ID, to objects, which is typically records, files, or directories, something like that. But proper access controls, should or might reasonably not show people or their programs things they're not allowed to access, whereas most current access controls say, oh, access denied, as opposed to there is no such thing. An example of the use of perception would be invisibility. So, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there if it can be invisible. So if you don't know what's there, it's harder to try to access it, guess what it is. And in fact, it reduces covert channels. The file name might imply content. If I have a directory called, Jones and Laughlin Steel, which I don't even know if they're in business anymore, but when I lived in Pittsburgh, I remember the name. We don't have them as a client. If it said Jones and Laughlin Steel, client 451, and that's the name of the directory, even if you couldn't access the directory, seeing the name of it would be useful information. This is actually commonly used in menu systems, right? Menu entries aren't available to some people, and those entries aren't shown in some cases. You can apply the same thing to networks, computers, directories, files, applications, and so forth. Here, there are lots of perception elements that are cross-cutting. So here's an example. Under management CISO, is there a security lead and where are they? We talk here about the level and placement of the security lead, which has everything to do with their power and influence and how others perceive the protection function and the protection lead. So this is about internal perception of the management structure and the place that protection has in the big picture. Metrics. Whatever you're doing to measure things, it's very likely that people will try to achieve the things you reward them for. And if you tell them to do things and there's no reward and no punishment associated with it, they may just ignore you. So that's a matter of their perception again. Deception. Most systems have some built-in deception, and most of them use it by default. For example, when you give a bad user ID, it still asks for a password, and whatever password you give it doesn't tell you, oh, that was a bad user ID. At least most current systems are at that level. Similarly, content control. Counterintelligence is about what attackers perceive. There are human factors issues, right? What decisions do users make and how do they make them? How do we assure that they have the information they need to make these decisions correctly? But also, there's the question of whether even the experts can make the decisions right. And if your expert can't make the right decision, then, guess what? You're going to have a problem. Interesting recent paper, so I very often find these things in literature. Here's an example. This is the psychology of malware warnings. And what this talks about, Ross Anderson, by the way, is an outstanding long-term researcher and author in information protection. So anything he writes, it might well be worth looking at. And this is talking about the psychology of warnings. If you give people too many warnings, what do they do, and so forth. And it's an excellent paper. I would certainly advise you to go out and read it. You can just download it. You look for the name on the internet, and you can find it. Reading this may harm your computer, the psychology of malware warnings. And there's a lot of literature in this field. So whereas this used to be sort of speculation, it's increasingly becoming part of the science of information protection. And I think that's a very good thing. I want to talk a little bit, this is the tool we use for the standard of practice. I'm just going to increase the font size here to make it easier to read out there in distant land. Very often we talk about the sorts of behavioral controls, and that's the next slide coming up. I'll just go to that next slide while we do this. Behavior is also cross-cutting and infused throughout. And an example is password controls. I tend to harp on this. We get lots of complaints about passwords from all sides. They're too easy to guess. You got to force them to be harder and longer. If they get too long, they're too hard to remember. They're too easy to steal, so don't write them down. But, I can't remember the 40-byte random string associated with each of the 500 different accounts I have out on the internet these days. If you take them, if somebody steals them, they grant access over time, which means drives people to change them more often. So now I have to memorize, 500 passwords of 40 random bytes once a month, once a week, once a day, every time I use them, and it just gets to be ridiculous. So it's an issue of excessive protection load. Of course, if you reuse them, breaking one system gets you to others, so don't reuse them. And it just, like I said, gets ridiculous. But there are alternatives. And I want to just point you to an example here you might want to read. It's called two-factor this into your thinking. It talks about the idea of using two-factor authentication and all the various issues and challenges associated with it. And again, you can just go to all.net on the homepage, and go there. And it's right there on 2014-09, two-factor this into your thinking. And we welcome you to read this. So there are a lot of behavioral issues that are cross-cutting. Trying to control user behaviors, of course, only works if they agree. They'll do reasonable things willingly. They'll do some unreasonable things, but only if you force them to do it. And if you force them, they'll fight back. They'll work more slowly. They'll complain to each other and become disgruntled, refuse to comply, or worse yet, comply maliciously. So they'll take 5 hours to do the 15-second task because they're being very, very careful to comply. They'll not put in extra effort to help the company succeed, and the list goes on and on. So behavioral controls, have to meaningfully support the users. My view is that protection is really not just about the data and the technology; it's about the people. And what you want to do is find ways to support normal human behaviors while affording protection through some limited amount of reasonable guidance. Here are some standard of practice examples of behavioral controls. Where do you have to work? And it depends on the situation. I think, was it Yahoo maybe that recently required employees to actually come to work instead of working from home all the time. Everybody said that'll kill the company, it's the end of the world or whatever. I mean, first of all, it's not the end of the world. It won't kill the company. And it's been going on for millennia. People have had to go to work. But there are some cases where you don't want to go to work, like if it's not habitable. But if it's habitable at a reasonable risk level, and you have system critical or non-critical workers, you can make different decisions. And here's an example: if workers can be at a distance facility, then the system has to be secured, the workers have to be secured, and the infrastructure has to be logically secured between them. Or you can do better, perhaps. But otherwise, if they cannot be at a distance secured facilities, then you co-locate the system, the infrastructures, and the workers in the secured facilities. Similarly, separation of duties associated with risk management. You can't allow somebody to specify, verify, and perform or manage protection or anything else, probably, if you don't want it to go wrong. So you need some separation of duties. Management procedures, how do you control things and what do you control and how closely do you control it? What's your security awareness program? Generally, people have these awareness programs. They don't sort of get the fundamental purpose of the awareness program is to have the users able to recognize the key situations and respond to them properly. It's really about teaching people how to behave. If you see this, do that. And if it gets to some philosophical level of awareness about the generic wonders of security, then it's not going to be very useful, and people won't, be able to help you by behaving properly in situation. So it's good that they know more and are more interested in it, but it really doesn't help as much as if the awareness program helps them, see and do the right thing. Malicious alteration detection, right? Again, problematic behaviors are detected and you respond to them. And there are many others fused throughout the standard practice. I just wanted to come back here and point out under syntax checking, it's an example of something that, we don't see enough of. We talk about the recent attacks, so-called shell shock. And, part of the content control, how do you keep useless and harmful content, out of my computing environment or under control? As a fundamental notion, in order to meet, the condition of content checking, you need to check inputs as a function of the state at each point where the input could cause harm, and only allow valid inputs in. So shell shock is an example where there's almost no situation where that particular sequence associated with the exploitation of shell shock, like it's set space, left paren, colon, semicolon, right paren, single quote. What legitimate inputs do you really have on your web system that would include that particular sequence that are going to get run through a command interpreter? Simple syntax checking would eliminate the vast majority of this sort of problem, and yet we don't use it as widely as we should. There are many more such things infused throughout the standard of practice, and I don't want to run at it forever because you can go and do it yourself. You know the process by now. Let's see. Well, we're not done yet, but we're getting close to the end of the year, that is. Not to the end of talking about protection or the standard of practice. Next month's webinar, we're going to talk about the second part of the internal part of technical security architecture, part 5 of the details, which is structure and content. So we're getting down to the last little bits here of the standard of practice. So I wanted to thank you all for joining us. I'm going to turn off the recording and welcome your questions.